Welcome to NOAA Live Alaska. My name is Lisa Hiruki-Raring and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is a collaborative effort by NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I work, NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Network, and NOAA's National Weather Service. This webinar series is designed to help you get to know NOAA's work in Alaska and how we connect and work with your communities. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, studies the ocean and the atmosphere and where the two meet, from weather to ocean to the animals that live around us. All of our speakers work for some part of NOAA or work in partnership with NOAA. We hope this gives you a sneak peek at different career paths that you might be interested in. Today, we're introducing you to Jasmine Maurer, who works for NOAA's Kachemak Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Kachemak Bay, Alaska. While we'll be talking about NOAA's role in research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we are all coming to you from the traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial Indigenous knowledge and much to share with us. We'd also like to acknowledge that Jasmine is presenting from the land of the Dena'ina and Sugpiaq people, and we are hosting this webinar from the traditional lands of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. A few guidelines before I hand you over to Jasmine. You're all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure that everyone can hear our speaker. However, there's a box where you can write questions, and we encourage you to ask them as we go, and my colleague Chris Beyer and I will be keeping track of the questions for Jasmine behind the scenes. She'll stop every now and again and answer a few questions. We may not get to all of our questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. All right, I'll hand it over to Jasmine to introduce herself.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Let me get this pulled up. Okay, thank you for that great introduction, Lisa. As she said, my name is Jasmine Maurer. And just a little bit about myself to get started. This is a picture of me in high school, and I'm standing in front of a two-person research sub. I took a marine biology class in high school and got to go out in the submarine as it was working its way to do a research project. And as soon as I got under the water, that was my first time ever going underwater, right here in Kachemak Bay in Alaska. And I immediately fell in love with the experience, and I wanted to do more in the ocean, and I wanted to be there more. So when I got to college, I went to Oregon State and I took every scuba diving class that I could on the weekends to get all my certifications that I could, and also went on exchange to Ecuador. This picture of me here there with a chocolate chip sea star, snorkeling. Between classes and homework, I spent every minute in the water, again, getting to know the wildlife, watching animal behavior. I just loved everything about being in the ocean and being around the animals and plants there. So finishing undergrad, I wasn't done yet. I didn't feel like I had learned enough yet. I wanted to do and be more in that environment and do research. So I went on to grad school. And although my grad school was at Moss Landing Marine Labs right there in Monterey Bay, California, so a shout out to the audience here from Santa Cruz. I went to school there, took classes there, but I got to come back to Alaska in the summertime, go out on groundfish surveys, which is what I was doing here. And I studied the age, growth, when they reach maturity, how many babies they had of Alaskan skate species. So this is me measuring the wingspan of a big skate. You can see it was pretty big as my arms there. And I just really enjoyed getting to do that research back here in Alaska. After grad school and a little bit of travel and play, I moved back to Homer, where I grew up, and got a job at the Research Reserve, where I have done work in juvenile salmon habitat, looking at what kind of habitats are juvenile salmon like here on the Kenai Peninsula, and have now moved into the harmful species program, where I work with Rosie Masui, and we monitor for harmful algal blooms in Kachemak Bay, as well as monitoring for marine invasive species, which is what I will be speaking about more today. So a little bit more background on the Research Reserve. As Lisa mentioned, we are a part of NOAA. So there is a National Estuary Research Reserve system. We are one, we are here in Kachemak Bay, of 29 NOAA designated reserves around the United States. And all reserves are a NOAA plus a local state partner, and ours is the University of Alaska Anchorage, and that's what makes up the Kachemak Bay National Estuary Reserve, those two big partnerships. The reserve in Kachemak Bay is shown here in this map. The yellow boundary marks all the reserve boundaries, that designation by NOAA, and as you can see, it's quite large. It takes up the whole 32 miles of Kachemak Bay and some of the watersheds outside of the bay as well. Okay, with that background about myself and the reserve, we'll dive into it more. So this is a picture from Alamy that is a kaleidoscope image of marine tunicates. Now these are tropical tunicates, but I wanted to include this image to share with you all just to show you some of the species that we look for when we're looking at invasive species. These are native to tropical areas. We don't have them here in Alaska, but you can see there's a real diversity in their color, their shape, and their form. These animals are an important part of our ocean ecosystems. It's when they get brought out of their range that they start to cause troubles. So the reason why we monitor for invasive species is because we know that early detection is the best way to prevent marine invasives from causing irreversible harm to the environment or to taking over an environment. So by being out there and looking for them, we are best able to detect them early and stop them from taking over. So that is the main goal of our monitoring program. Now, what is an invasive species? Before we go any further, I've mentioned them a lot so far, and I would love to hear from you all about what you already know about invasive species or how you think of them. So go ahead and type your answer in the chat box.
So for those of you in our audience, what Jasmine would like to know from you guys is what is your definition of what an invasive species is? And so if you can type that into your chat box, we have Kevin saying that it's any non-native species. We've got Kurt saying that it's things living where they don't belong that push out the local critters and plants. Jasper from Juneau is saying that an invasive species is a plant or an animal that's not supposed to be there. And Anna Maria is saying that it's a kind of animal that hurts and harms the environment. Hunter is saying it's a non-native species that's harmful to the environment. Michelle says it's not supposed to be there. There's a lot of people, Texas, Theodore, Elijah, are saying that it's a non-native thing, an animal from other parts that shouldn't be there. So there's a lot of the themes of that it's an animal or a plant from somewhere else, and that it multiplies too much. So what's your definition of an invasive species, Jasmine?
Yeah, you guys really hit on some of the key points. And the way we define an invasive species is that it is a species that is introduced by people, so that's a key part, and it causes harm to the ecosystem, the economy, or human health. So again, you guys got a hit on some of those key points, but it's really that brought to an area by people and causes harm, and it can be a plant or an animal. Now, the traits of invasive species, there's 3 broad traits that all invasive species share. And the first one, just like the stars on my screen here, and someone mentioned this, is that they grow and reproduce really quickly. So once they get to an area, just like these stars on my screen, they just start multiplying and they can really take over quickly. Another trait is that they're aggressive. So this is a picture of a lionfish, which is an invasive species that causes troubles in our warmer waters around the United States, not here in Alaska. But I included this image because it can really show you how aggressive some invasive species are, both in their physical form. So this lionfish has spines everywhere. Who wants to give that animal a hug? Like, no, thank you. It's just defending itself and aggressive and can push its way into places. It also has quite a large mouth, so it can eat just about it will eat anything that fits in its mouth. So invasive species are aggressive both in behavior and in their defense mechanisms or their different physical characteristics. And finally, invasive species have few predators or natural diseases in the area that they've newly arrived to. So it would be similar to this crab arriving to a place where there were no seagulls that would eat it. So again, few predators or native diseases that keep those populations of invasive species in check. So the next natural question could be, how do invasive species get introduced to an area? And we refer to these pathways of introduction as vectors. And the vectors are ways that people, again, bring a species, a plant, or an animal to an area. So I'd love to hear from you about what ways you can think of that people can bring invasive plants or animals to an area.
So that's a really good question, Jasmine. So to our audience, what ways can you think of that people can bring invasive plants or animals to an area? Hunter is saying that people can bring them in their boats. Theodora is saying like on ships, like rats. Ella is saying they bring them as pets but can't take care of them anymore and release them to the wild. Haley says online shopping. Michelle says on their clothes. A lot of folks are saying on boats. So Elijah, Jillian, Karen are saying boats. Karen is saying ship hulls or aquariums. Kevin is saying on bottom of shoes. So a lot of people are saying boats or sticking to clothes or as pets. So, and Hunter is saying releasing animals into the environment like Burmese pythons, which I think are a problem in Florida. So
Yes.
what are you, what are the ways that you see most often, Jasmine?
Well, I am really impressed by the audience. You all clearly know your marine and invasive species topics here, but you hit on the big ones. So I believe someone said in your shoes, right? That's one way. So marine invasive species can hitchhike along with people, whether it's a seed in your shoe or an animal that climbs in your backpack, and you might not know it's there. So these pathways to introduction can be intentional, or a lot of times they're unintentional. Another way someone mentioned, or was pretty close to this one, is the shipping of things, especially live seafood and bait. So I am going to focus on the marine environment here and the main pathways for marine invasive species introductions. So the whole point of shipping a plant or animal alive is that it arrives alive at its destination. However, if that animal is improperly discarded, or the plant, or it escapes, they could establish a new invasive population in the area where they have escaped to. Another one that several of you mentioned is the improper disposal or release of pets. So here's a cartoon of someone dumping their aquarium fish into a lake or stream and hoping that no one's looking. But really, animals can survive, even being flushed down the toilet, animals can survive that. So it's really important that we take responsibility when we no longer can care for or want a pet, that we return it to the pet store or otherwise properly dispose of it so it doesn't become an invasive species. Another one is marine debris. So animals will, when there's like a big net like this that might have gotten washed out after a tsunami event, for example, or even just a high tide when folks weren't paying attention, animals and plants can grow on these different debris types, and the currents will carry them from Japan all the way over to the coast of Alaska. Animals also will take shelter in them, even if they're not growing on the debris. They like to have that something to take shelter in, and will follow it with the currents from one place to another. And then finally, you all mentioned this, boats. So ship fouling, which is the picture I'm showing here, which means stuff growing on boats. When those boats go from one place to another, those barnacles that you can see, or that algae or whatever else might be growing on the boat, is going with it and can introduce new species to a new place. The other way that boats can introduce species is through ballast water. And this is one that's actually attributed to the most introductions of marine invasive species in the world. So this large ship, when it goes to leave port, might take on water in its ballast, and that water can be held in those tanks until such time it no longer needs it. And if it just dumps that water back out again, like's happening here, and it didn't do any treatment at all, any of the larvae or the eggs or the adult or baby animals or plants that might be in that water can now establish new populations wherever it's being dumped. So those are the main vectors for invasive species in the marine environment to be introduced. I do want to say that there's a lot of people doing really good work, especially with the ballast water here, to pass new regulations, to develop new technologies, to install systems in new boats or retrofit old boats so that ballast water is being treated and this no longer continues to contribute in such a big way to marine invasive species introductions. Okay, before we dive into our monitoring program, I wanted to take a moment and see if the audience has any questions for me at this time.
Wow, that's a lot of information. We had a comment that there seemed to be a lot of invasive species on that boat hull, and I was wondering whether you have an idea of how many invasive species you get in your particular area.
That's a good question. It depends on if we're talking about the ocean or on land. Um, Currently in Kachemak Bay, I'm really happy to say that we don't have any known marine invasive species, but throughout Alaska, there are a couple that we know of in the marine environment. And on land, especially near roadways, we tend to see more invasive species of plants and that sort of thing. Does that get to?
Yeah, great. So that's good to know that you don't have that many invasive species that you're looking at in Kachemak Bay. Ella was wondering what kind of invasive species do you deal with, plants or animals? And I know that you're going to get into a couple of species later on, but in general, do you deal with plants or animals?
Yeah. Animals, so our program is focused in the marine environment, and there are two animal species that we know are a big threat to Kachemak Bay and to the South Central Alaska area. So those are the two that we monitor for currently. There are a lot of folks that are looking, and a lot of research has been done looking at invasive species pathways up to Alaska, whether it's through the Arctic or coming up the coast from the south. And as we're aware of new species, the monitoring and the state awareness will continue to grow with that.
We have a couple of questions about ballast water, and so I'm going to sort of combine. Anna Maria and Kurt both had questions about ballast water, and so I was wondering how can ships treat their ballast water to prevent the transfer of invasive species?
It's a good question. And there are several different technologies that I know are either being tested or are currently being used. Some of them are going to be chemical treatments, so to make sure that none of the plants or animals that are in that ballast water can survive. Others might be UV light. So these are big systems that would go on the boat and would treat all that water that comes in and out of the boat. And then of course need to make sure that the water is safe to be dumped back into the ocean. So just to get rid of, not have any chemicals that they're dumping out if that's what they use. So it's relatively benign things. The other way that can be done is through more frequent stops and changing the ballast water. So they might take ballast water on in a certain area and in a similar ecosystem, dump that ballast water out and take on new ballast water it requires more stopping and going of the vessels. So there's some transport companies that might not prefer that method and would prefer the treatment method. So those are some of the ways that people are dealing with the ballast water issue.
That's really neat. And actually, I guess, if you're looking at smaller boats, I know that in freshwater systems, that people encourage boaters to drain their boats before they go to another water system. So that could also be a simpler solution for smaller boats, perhaps, that are getting taken out of the water.
Absolutely. And that works, yes, for both in the marine environment and the freshwater environment. The slogan is clean, drain, dry. So clean off anything you see growing on your boat, drain any water that might be in your boat, in your bilge or those sorts of areas, and then let it get all the way dry. And typically it's 3 full days for where we're talking about the marine environment to really ensure that nothing is going to survive and be transported to the next place where you put your boat in.
That's really interesting. I have one last question before we go to the next section. Duffy had wanted to know, can migrating whales or elephant seals serve as vectors?
Oh, that is a really good question. And the answer is no, um, and yes. So, because the working definition of invasive species is human introductions, then they would fall outside of that if they were brought by a migrating whale or seal. Generally speaking, the species that are migrating back and forth have been doing it, and the animals, the barnacles that grow on a whale's tail, for example, have been making that journey with them from the beginning of that evolution of that relationship. And so those are not invasive species. However, I love to hypothesize, so you're getting me excited here. I could hypothesize a scenario where an invasive species somehow, I don't know enough about marine mammals to think of what might be something that was able to attach to, say, the collar that they had on or some other thing that wasn't native to them at one end of their migration, and then they would take it to the other, and that could be a problem. But I don't have enough background about marine mammals to know specifically what it might be, but that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, maybe it's something that our audience members could research themselves at some point. So great.
Yes.
Well, I know you have a lot more information to share with us. So let's hold our questions for now and then keep going.
Okay. So the Research Reserves Monitoring Program, we focus on 2 species. One is the European green crab. Here's a bucket full of them here from area in Washington where they were captured. And the other is tunicates. And I will dive into more about what tunicates are. Our invasive tunicate monitoring program began in 2006, so it's been going on a long time. It's a partnership with the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. This person is holding up a line that hung off a dock, and each one of these large globules is a Mogula species, which is, you can see they get quite large, tunicate that is native to Alaska. So we see these when we're out there. So what are tunicates? Well, they're animals. They have generally a round or cylindrical body, and then 2 siphons to take in their food and excrete any waste. They are filter feeders, so they're bringing in water and filtering food out and then putting the water out on the other siphon, an in-out system. They spend their adult lives attached in one place. So this is a picture of the intertidal in Kachemak Bay, and these groups of globs here you see in orange, those are all tunicates, and they are going to be there their whole lives. They can be solitary, like this individual here, so one large orange tunicate, or they can be colonial, which means a lot of individuals living together. They actually reproduce by cloning themselves. So this is a colony here, this pinky color, and this orange one is another colony. And they are commonly called sea squirts. And Lisa's going to show a short video for us.
Yeah, I'm just going to get us loaded up here. So here we go. We're about to start. And here. So Jasmine,
so these are
don't forget
Mogula species. Oh.
Go ahead.
These are Mogula species, and you can see when these folks, they've pulled up this cage that has lots of tunicates growing on them. They can grow quite fast, and every time they touch or squeeze one, the water is squirting all over the place. So that is where they get their name sea squirt. And now that you've seen this, perhaps the next time that you're out tide pulling and you see a tunicate, you can see just how far their water will squirt. And again, they pull water in, they filter food out, and then they have the out siphon. And when you see them at low tide, they will squirt that water out at you as well. So they can grow quite well, quite quickly.
Great. And I'm just switching the control back to you, Jasmine.
Okay. So, I'm going to skip back to the slide we were on. Here we go. Okay. Thank you, Lisa. So life of a tunicate. Tunicates have a larval stage that would look like this if you looked at it under a microscope. They spend a couple days in the water column, about a week actually, not a couple days, before they find a place to settle. And then they undergo a metamorphosis where they get metamorphized, absorb their tail into their adult form. This is an image of an adult tunicate, and I really like to share this one because it's got that transparent tunic or the transparent outer shell so you can see them. So here's the in siphon that comes in here. This is the brachial arches where they filter out all their food, and then the out siphon for waste and extra seawater. This space down here is where their heart is and their digestive system, and all tunicates are going to have this same anatomy. You just can't see it if they don't have a transparent tunic. So these are some examples of Alaskan tunicates, and you can see the diversity in color and shape that we have here. A lot of different tunicates are native to Alaska, but there is one that we are concerned about that we know is already in an area just outside of Sitka. It's called Didenum vexillum. This is what it looks like growing over a oyster net. You can see it's globby and orange and totally covers that space there. Its common name is sea vomit. or it can be referred to as sea vomit, which I think you might all be able to see why. And just to show what this looks like underwater, we have another quick video to share with you.
Okay, so I'm going to load up the video here. And for those of you who might be having trouble seeing the video, sometimes the video screen pops up behind your main screen, or if you're on an iPad, you need.
So the noise that you all are hearing is someone breathing on scuba to get this footage, and this is the Didenum vexillum that's growing outside of Sitka, so already in Alaska. You can really notice how it is covering everything.
Okay, and here we go. I'm going to switch it back to you, Jasmine.
Thank you. Okay. Ooh. Okay, so this is another picture of the DVEX, the invasive tunicate that we know is there's a population there at, in Southeast Alaska. And the main threat with this one, the main threats with this species and with a lot of invasive tunicates is that they do grow and reproduce so quickly that anything that doesn't move out of the way, any mussels, any algae, even some slow moving invertebrates, it will totally cover and smother. And this is a problem because it lowers the diversity of that area. Excuse me. It also will make it hard for oyster farmers if it gets on their nets for their oysters to get the food and water that they need, or any water movement for industry. It'll plug up tubes and intake valves and things. So really can cause a lot of problems for infrastructure. All right, and I will take a few more questions here before we move on.
Okay, Texas was wondering, where does the sea vomit live naturally when it's not an invasive species? Where is its natural habitat?
That one comes from the Western Pacific.
Oh, interesting. So it's moved up quite a fair ways if it's coming up to Alaska then.
Yes.
And then Elijah was wondering, how do you get rid of an invasive species once you have it?
Elijah, that is a great question, and it is a real challenge. So, especially in the ocean, where it's all one big body of water and you have these species that have larval stages that get carried around on the currents, it can be very challenging. It can be hard. One way that a lot of in lakes, for example, you can block off those lakes sometimes and treat them to get rid of an invasive species. But in the ocean, that's much harder to do because it's one big system. So a lot of the removal has to do with physical removal. So in Sitka, Alaska Department of Fish and Game is working with the community there and partners there to remove the defects from that area. It's a lot of physical removal of any structures where it's growing. They're looking at doing dosing to get rid of it. A lot of education to let people don't come into this harbor if at all possible, don't spread it, those sorts of methods.
Kurt was wondering, how quickly do the tunicates grow? And I know that you're going to have something that kind of gets into that a little bit later, but he was wondering whether it grows as fast as kudzu, which is a plant that grows a few inches a day, or does it grow more slowly?
That is a great question. I don't know exactly how fast tunicates grow. There's going to be some variety depending on the species and the time of year. But because they are able to clone themselves, those colonial tunicates like the DVEX, the amount of spread is very quickly, but I don't have an exact time for you. It's a great question.
And then Anna Maria was wondering, how many types of tunicates live in Alaska?
Oh, Anna Maria, there are so many. There are so many. So I don't have an exact number. I think tunicates can be challenging to ID, and we are learning since we've been doing the monitoring program here in Kachemak Bay. Our staff and the folks have been helping us from the lower 48 that are experts in tunicates to identify them. I have never actually counted how many are in our ID guide for some tunicates. It's not even all of the tunicates for South Central Alaska.
I know that just looking at the variety of tunicates that you were showing, it's pretty incredible just to see how many there are just looking at them. So I can imagine that there would be a lot.
Yes.
So maybe we can go on to the next section and talk a little bit about how you monitor for them.
Yes. So our monitoring program we do in the Homer Harbor and the Seldovia Harbor, and this is my coworkers Rosie and Dana, and they're holding their our tunicate guide. You can also see in front of them a tote that has water, and we use that tote because it's much easier to identify the animals and plants when they're actually in some seawater instead of drooping flat um, in the air. So we go out to the harbor. We go out every 4 to 6 weeks during the summertime when things are growing most quickly here in Kachemak Bay. We have a setup that includes a brick and a PVC plate. This PVC plate is about 4 inches by 4 inches, and we use PVC because we know that tunicates like to settle on it. So if there are any invasive tunicates coming into the area, we are more likely to detect them by using the PVC plate. We hang this on a line in the water, and again, we leave it that 4 to 6 weeks. And when we come back to look at it, we might see this much growth on it. So you can really see in Alaska in the summertime, there's a lot of stuff in the water that starts to grow. We identify everything. If we take samples if we need to. So far, we haven't seen any invasive species in Alaska, in Kachemak Bay, and we'll continue to monitor. So the other monitoring program that we do is for European green crab. This is a picture provided to us by Washington Sea Grant. You can see that this crab is green. However, they can be different colors. So the green is not a real surefire way to identify them. But we can identify them based on their shape. So they have a very distinctive carapace or back shell shape with 5 bumps on the outside of the eye, or 5 spines, and 3 bumps in the middle, and then 5 on the other side. So that 5, 3, 5. They're also relatively small. The maximum width of that carapace is going to be about 4 inches. And their hind legs are modified, they're flattened to help them with swimming versus being rounded, stiff walking legs. But the 5, 3, 5, those 5 spines on the outside of the eye is the key for identifying a European green crab. European green crab are originally from Europe, shown here in the blue. The areas in green are the areas they've already established an invasive species population. You can see that they're right just to the south of us in BC, Canada. So that area of the south central Alaska coastline is a threatened area and with habitat that would be suitable for green crab, and they're also very close to where that we know they already are. This is a map zoomed in of BC and Southeast Alaska. So here in the purple is Juneau, just to help you find your way around this map. The yellow dots are 2 new places where monitoring programs started last summer. So we're really excited that there's a monitoring program there for that early detection should invasive green crab arrive. All the dots along the British Columbia coast, the red are areas where they've already found green crab. So here's the farthest north that we know of. And then the black are areas they are monitoring, but they've yet to see them. So European green crab are quite close to Southeast Alaska. This is a species that we monitor for because they are in the top 10 most unwanted species in the world as far as invasives go. One of the threats for them is habitat destruction and degradation. So they are burrowers. They will get back into sediments and soft river or estuarine edges, and that causes a lot of erosion, which will affect the habitat of our baby salmon or adult salmon, as well as other shoreline creatures. They also eat a lot. These green crabs, although they're small, eat a lot every day. They will eat many clams or mussels a day. They'll eat other crabs that are up to the same size as they are. So again, an aggressive species that eat and eat and eat. They're also omnivores. So they will eat eelgrass, which directly affects those eelgrass beds, but also their burrowing is going to have an effect on the health of our eelgrass bed. And eelgrass beds we know are really important for our shorebirds and our juvenile fishes. They also can survive in a wide range of habitats. So if you think about all of south central, southeast East Alaska. There's a lot of habitats there. There's rocky intertidal, there's estuaries like this one shown here, and sandy coastlines. And green crabs can tolerate all those salinities, all those temperatures, all those different types of substrates. They also reproduce a lot, and we talked about this at the beginning. So this is a female green crab. She's holding her eggs in her on her abdomen there, and there are over 200,000 eggs in that clutch, and she can reproduce twice a year with that many eggs. And then finally, European green crabs, again, we're speaking about them as being an invasive species we don't want, but they're pretty incredible animals. They're very, very resilient. So they can survive a long time out of water, and they can also survive in all those different environments we just spoke about. They also have a unique ability among crabs to use a modified set of gills shown here to absorb nutrients out of the water and essentially filter feed in times when food is scarce. So again, very resilient, have very high survivalship in harsh conditions. Okay, so it's an introduction into green crabs. Does anyone have any questions now?
We have a bunch of questions about green crabs, actually. Let's see. So Sawyer, Oliver, and Finn were saying that they found that there were green crabs that were found off the west coast of Newfoundland in Canada, and so they were interested in looking at the spread of green crab. And then Terry Lindquist's class in Kodiak was wondering, she has a third grade class there. They were wondering, are there any green crab or invasive tunicate species spotted in Kodiak? And I think you had said that the green crabs are not yet in Alaska, but
Correct.
Is that true?
That's correct. There are not yet green crabs in Alaska, but it is really great that Metlakatla has begun doing monitoring as of last summer down in Southeast, because we anticipate that's where they'll make it to Alaska first. In general, green crab they were introduced in San Francisco in the 80s, and they've been making their way north. And as we've seen in years of El Nino, for example, their larvae tend to be able to jump much farther during those warm water regimes than in other cooler years.
So we had a couple of questions about eating green crabs. Kurt had wanted to know, do green crabs taste good and can people eat them? Carol was wondering whether they could be, one way to handle these invasive species is to harvest them and eat them that way. So what's the thought on green crabs there?
Well, I love your guys' questions. These are such good questions. Yes, and no. Are you enjoying that answer yet? So in certain species of invasive species, that has been an effective way to deal with them. The lionfish, for example, is one that in some areas they will harvest and serve as food. Green crab are a little bit trickier in that they can be eaten. They're a crab, but they're relatively small. With that top carapace only being 4 inches in diameter, they don't have a lot of meat on them. So it's a little bit trickier to find folks that are willing to take the time to harvest them and eat them for such a low amount of meat, relatively speaking. When you can have Dungeness, it'd be tough to imagine someone wanting to eat a green crab.
Or even king crabs, which are much bigger, right?
Oh, yes. Didn't want everybody's mouth to water too much before lunchtime.
Yeah. So Ella was wondering, you had shown that map where green crabs are native. They're called European green crabs, right? So they're native to Europe. But she was wondering whether there are green crabs on the east coast of the US. And so I was wondering whether you could remind us.
Yes, green crab are definitely a problem on the east coast of the United States, as well as Washington, Oregon, and California.
Great. And then and actually Mabel and Ruby from Arizona were wondering, how did green crabs get to San Diego?
They migrated down that way. So the introduction on the west coast was the port was San Francisco. And then over time, they migrated their way down the coast, whether it was, so your green crab have a larval stage just like all crabs do. Their larval stage is particularly long, up to 2 months. And so that's a long time for them to ride around in the current to get to new places. Or the adult crabs are mobile and they will slowly make their way into new habitats as well.
Great. And then Carl and Carol had a question about, if green crab are too small for humans to really, get a lot out of trying to harvest and eat them, could they be harvested for feed for like a farmed marine species or cat food or dog food or something like that?
Yeah, I am not aware of that being done, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. Um, it could totally be a possibility.
And then Theodora was wondering, you had said that green crabs eat a lot, and so he was wondering how much do they eat?
I have seen in some literature up to 40 clams a day, which would be a lot for me to eat.
Yeah, for one small 4-inch crab, that's
Yeah.
a lot of clams. Great. Well, I think that we did have a question about ballast water beforehand. One of our viewers, let's see, um, I think that we had a question about Jillian. So that was actually Sawyer, Oliver, and Finn were wondering, how do creatures get sucked into boats from our ballast water discussion before?
Yeah, so a lot, including green crab and tunicates, a lot of animals in the ocean have microscopic life stages where a swordfish, for example, the egg is microscopic, and when it first hatches, that swordfish is it's teeny, teeny, tiny. And in the course of a year, they eat so much, and they grow so fast, they grow to be those big swordfish that we see people catching and mounting on their walls. So a lot of species, fish species, crab species, octopus, squid, have these tiny larval stages that are floating around in the water and moving on the currents, the plankton and the zooplankton. And that way they get sucked up in the water that these big ships use to help them maintain their balance as they're traveling around the ocean and offloading and onloading cargo, and they need to keep their weight evenly distributed.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I think that thinking about different life stages of animals, I could see where many species might get sucked up into that water. Texas also
Mhm.
had a question about, I think that he was struck by that picture of the boat hull that you showed with all of the creatures on it, and was wondering, how do you clean the bottom of those boats?
Yeah, there are well-established protocol for good cleaning methods for boats so that you can haul your boat out of the water and scrape it clean or wash it clean, or let it dry, as we spoke about earlier, for those full 3 days so that nothing survives that. It's important that you make sure that any of those methods are done in a place where the water, should it rain, or if you are washing the bottom of your boat, don't drain right back into the harbor or right back into the bay or the lake or whatever body of water is near. So you want to make sure that any boat cleaning, any of those bottoms that get cleaned, are done well away from the water so that you don't just flush them right back down into the water.
That makes total sense. Okay, I know that you have one more section to go through, so maybe we'll hold on to the rest of our questions and see what else you have to talk about.
Okay. So next I'm going to move into how we monitor for European green crab. And our monitoring program is really community-based. So we do some monitoring ourselves, but we also go into classrooms when there isn't a pandemic going on. And we spend a day with the students in the classroom. We teach them how to identify green crab and our other native crab species, how to use the gear that we're going to use, fill out the data sheet, and then we go out with them and actually do a monitoring event. So I'm going to turn my camera back on here. All right, can you see me, Lisa?
Yep.
Okay, so this is a crab trap that we use, excuse me, and it's just a folding trap, pretty simple. We have these two stakes where we can stake it down into the sand or the gravel to help it hold there. We then also, so we get the critters coming into our trap, use a simple Tupperware container where we've drilled holes. Oh, smells like herring. That's the bait that we use, very sticky, attracts those animals right in. And we lay those out along the beach. And I have an image to share, so I'll go back to my slides here. Okay. So this is a group that we took out a couple years ago, where you can see they've got their traps here with the bait in them staked into the mud, and we lay 6 traps each time we do a sampling event, and we just lay them along the low tide line, spaced out so that it covers the whole length of the beach that we're sampling that day. We do this at low tide. We wait 24 hours so the tide comes in and out a couple times, and then we go back and we look at all the animals that have been caught. We measure the crabs to see how big they are. We also identify if they're male or female. We identify all the other species that have been caught and release them right there at the site alive. So that is the monitoring program, the protocols that we follow. In Kachemak Bay in 2020, we had 4 different sampling sites indicated by the different red dots. These are not lines, these are dots. So we are able to disperse throughout Kachemak Bay and do these because we have our staff as well as our community monitors, volunteers, and then again, in normal years, we go out with school groups as well. We really enjoy getting to do this program with our community. We find that there's a lot of benefits. Number one is the partnerships and the relationships that we form. And also, just to reiterate, by having more folks participate and know about the potential for marine invasive species, it increases our chances of early detection. And when we have that early detection, it's really our best opportunity to prevent them from causing harm or establishing a population, because we can detect them early and keep those numbers low so they don't become a problem. I'm just going to share this website with you all for some resources. If folks are interested in taking out a guide to some tunicates of Alaska the next time you go tide pooling, it can be found here, as well as our crab identification guide that includes a diagram and description of the European green crab and some of the most common native species that we see in Kachemak Bay. Both of our monitoring programs produce an annual report every year, and if anyone's interested in beginning to receive those, please send me an email. My email address is right here. And I just want to thank everybody for tuning in and such great questions so far. I imagine you might have some more here as I sign off or wrap up the presentation. Won't sign off yet. I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah, Jasmine, actually, we do have quite a few more questions, and I just also wanted to let our viewers know that I will be putting the website for the resources to share on our NOAA Live Alaska website. So you can also check there after. I'll put it up after our webinar here. But we did have some more green crab questions, and so one of the questions that we had was Haley had wanted to know what are the natural predators of green crabs, so like both in their native habitat, like in Europe, and also over in this area where they've invaded. What are their natural predators?
That's a really great question. So in Europe, they tend to have some diseases that help keep the population in check there that we don't have in the United States and we don't want to bring here because they would also affect our native crab species. So disease is a really important population control for a lot of invasive species, but not a very good one to bring into an area because it can affect the native populations that are already there being affected by the invasive species. Also, we have partners in Canada that are seeing that the red rock crab seems to eat green crab in the areas and might even keep it out of some of the rocky intertidal areas there. Because they're not in Alaska yet, we're not as sure, or we just don't know what species might eat them. They've also seen some evidence in Canada of the mammals that forage in the intertidal. Bears is one that I've heard people mention, but some of those other animals might also take advantage and eat the green crab when they're there. So.
Great. And then Duffy had wanted to know, how can harm from the green crab be prevented or minimized?
It's a good question. And really, by keeping the populations low, should they be detected? So really early detection so that we can do a lot of trapping would be what would happen in that case. If we detected green crab, we'd want to do a lot of trapping and prevent those populations from exploding. Because once you get those really big populations is when you start to see a lot of that damage. They're consuming more, they're eating our native crab species, they're having an impact on our salmon habitat. So we would really want to keep those numbers low with early detection.
Great. And actually that was a question that Mabel and Ruby had, because they live in Arizona, and they were saying, what can people do if they don't live in those areas to, I don't know, do something about invasive species? Or I mean, one of the things that I could think of is to look into invasive species in their own area. What would you say, Jasmine?
Yeah, Lisa, you're exactly right. Invasive species is a problem in every environment around the world. It's something that folks are concerned about and have seen impacts of. So in Arizona, there would probably be some species of concern, some plants that might grow along the roadways, or people might have planted them not knowing. Another, in Alaska, one of the invasive species that's a problem in our lakes here is Elodia. And that's a problem in other places around the United States. Zebra mussels are also a problem in freshwater lakes and streams in the United States. So that might be one you might see, but there's definitely invasive species that cause problems in all areas of the world.
I know that in Arizona, there are a lot of native fish species in the lakes there that they are quite concerned about invasive species. So, so Mabel and Ruby, if you wanted to know about what invasive species might be of concern in your area, you could do some research on the internet, and this could be the same for everybody online here. You could look into what invasive species are of concern in the areas where you live and see what kind of steps people can take to. And I think the other thing is that people can always talk to other people who might not know about invasive species, and that's another way of helping too.
Yeah, and being aware of it. So you take the time, and a lot of parks and trailheads now, they have boot brushes, for example. So when you're done with your hike, you can wash your boot off or scrub your boot off of any mud that might have got anything stuck in the tread, so that you don't carry something to the next spot. Reading the signage at trailheads or in lakes, boat docks that might inform you about best practices for keeping your boat and your gear clean so that you're not transporting species from one place to another. Those are all things that we can do. And being familiar with what the invasive species are so that you can report them to your local. In Alaska, it would be Fish and Game. There's a invasive species number, 1-800-1888 invasive. I'll have to get it to you, Lisa. Where people can report invasive species if they see one, and they really encourage, even if you don't know, it's just great to have it reported. And if it ends up not being a concern, that's better than not having it reported. Because again, early detection is the key.
And we do have a fellow invasive species expert, Linda Shaw, who is on the line, who has said that in Arizona, bullfrogs, turtles, quagga mussels are invasive, and also red-eared slider turtles. So Mabel and Ruby, if you are interested, you could follow up and look at what the problems are with those species. So yeah, it's one of the other questions that folks had, I think Hunter had, was how fast do green crabs reproduce, and how does that add to the problem?
Yeah, green crab females can have 2 clutches of eggs a year, and they're about 200,000 eggs per clutch, so quite a few.
Great. And finally, I think this will be our last question as we're wrapping up, is that we had a couple of questions about what your favorite part of your job is. And so what would you say the favorite part of your job is?
Can I have 2? I really enjoy getting to do these outreach events and hearing the questions that come up, because it helps to inform me about my job and what things folks don't know or are interested in knowing that can help us all in this line of work. And I love being out on the water and doing that work still, just like when I was a kid and when I was in high school and college, getting to go out in the environment, doing the trapping and seeing our native crab species doing well, identifying the different things. I just love being out there and seeing what's going on underwater.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your work and your passions with us, Jasmine. We learned a lot about invasive species today, I think. And thank you to all of our audience members for signing in. And hope you guys can come back next week for our next NOAA Live Alaska webinar. Next week we're having a tour of the Kodiak lab, so that will be kind of cool. And thank you again, Jasmine, for speaking with us.
Yes, thanks for having me, and thanks for all the great questions, everyone.
All right, we'll shut things down here. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.